Hello there ladies and gents, and welcome to our fourth part of the World Builder Wiki video series with me, MonolithicBacon. In this segment we will cover the basics of the object placement tool, the spline placement tool in a little bit more detail, and the first use of the height map editor, as well as how to export your map. The duration of this fourth part will conclude everything for the very basics of our tutorial, and everything that carries on after this point will be more advanced, going into the finer details of how to create a map for Company of Heroes 2. What we should have at the conclusion of this fourth video will be basic objects including groves and buildings. We should already have a working territory layout. We should have some basic geometry to our map so that it looks like it has some height differences to it, and we may even place a little bit of water in there just for flavour. What you should end up with is a very simplistic map, but one that is undoubtedly playable and should give you some enjoyment if this is all that you are after. Please remember, however, that these videos will continue in part 5, going through the far more advanced stages, including tile painting and further object placement, in order to beef up your maps and make them more professional and overall more enjoyable. Now, where we were when we left our map 2-player flood was just after concluding our territory placement. As you can see, we have all of our territory flags and we have all of our territory areas painted out as before. Now what I'm tempted to do at this stage, since our territory is already painted, if I click on the territory editor on the toolbar, it should show me that all of them there are in place. Granted, they are still pretty rough. Go on to overlay and toggle overlay, I can get back to my normal view. And in this case, I should go back on overlay and get the 32-meter grid back out. But I can't do that while I'm still in the territory editor. That's something I should remember. Object placement tool is what I'll need, and then overlay a 32-meter grid. I can give a bird's eye view once more. I can grab the spline placement tool, and instead of going through all the trouble of the blueprint list as before, I will just click and drag over all the splines within this area. Hit texture on the spline tool, go down to NM UI once more, and I'm going to change it back to our dotted line by clicking assign. Now this is simply because I think the dotted line spline is a little bit neater, and it will tell me where I should be placing objects, and that's what we'll start with. If you go back onto the object placement tool, which we've only used before to place the flags and to move the HQ areas, we're going to have a look at probably the most important folder that you will come across. But before we go on to that, there's a little tick box up here that says use random rotation, and I can't emphasize enough how useful that tool can be. So I click it straight away. And what this will do is every object that you place from here on in will have a random rotation to it, as the name suggests. Now, if you go into EBPS as before, this time instead of going into gameplay, which is where the flags, the HQ markers, the map entry points are, we want to go into environment. Inside environment, you've got 3 folders, 2 of which are what you'll spend the vast majority of your time trawling through. Art Ambient refers to any man-made objects, buildings, barriers, sandbags, and so on. Whereas Art Nature, again as the name suggests, will be things like trees, bushes, hedgerows, and rocks. Now, one of the things that most maps will stand out for in Company of Heroes 2 is trees and hedgerows for the most part. So we'll start with Art Nature, and what we're looking for here is to plant some very basic things that will change the flow of gameplay through our map. Anyways, within Art Nature we have several different sections, animals, bushes, and so on. But where we have trees, you've got 2 categories, trees L and trees S, which refer to large and small. If we go into trees L, we'll find a certain section called groves. Now these could be birch groves, they can be just generic, I imagine they are oak groves. There's dead versions of them as well, and there's pine, which were added with the Ardennes salt. But you can choose any of these that you want. There's no real complications with mixing and matching as you go along. That only really occurs with buildings, which we'll have a look at later. But the idea is that these groves will not only block movement, they will block shots or sight. if I get Grove 1, which is probably my favourite, as well as Grove 2, or at least the most popular, I can left click them and then right click on the map somewhere to place them. Now, the idea is this selection of red squares shows me the imprint or the footprint of this actual object, and no units will be able to move through that. They will be able to shoot through, but they won't be able to see through necessarily. If I show you as well the LOS tool, which is up on your taskbar on the very top right, this is line of sight, which was added with Company of Heroes 2, and it shows how true sight works. Oops. If I click on that, it will show me what objects can and cannot be seen around. By moving it around here, you can see that there's a much brighter area, which is my line of sight, and as I move the mouse, I can see around the tree. I cannot see through it. So what we'll need to do is try to place a variety of different groves around the HQ area, just to try and isolate it so that they aren't entirely exposed. I would usually recommend 2 or 3 pathways into a HQ, depending on how wide they are. But this setup is very, very normal. What you may find in some other maps is to replace this frontmost one with hedgerows instead, since hedgerows can be crushed later on in the game, and it will open up the HQ area for a final attack. But for now, let's just use Grove 1 and Grove 2, and just fill these gaps in. Now, if I've not made it clear, which I probably should have done, I'm using the exact same hotkey as I did with the Spline Tool much earlier in our tutorials, where if you hold the C key, once you've clicked on something, you can just left click and drag to create a duplicate of it. But every single time I right click one of these objects here, it will automatically give it a random rotation. And if you want to change that rotation, hold the shift key, left click, and just move them about as you wish. Either way, if you hover over them again, you should see that they've all got the same footprint, and as long as all these footprints match up, there shouldn't be any gaps for units to run through. As unlikely as it might seem, occasionally you can end up leaving some small gaps that units can slip through. Now, groves shouldn't be used absolutely everywhere. A lot of new mappers might end up placing far too many of them, and when it comes down to it, what you want is a battlefield that will change and adapt as you play through it. You don't want there to be static barriers all the time. So be careful where you place your groves in the very centre of the map. For example, if I use Grove 2 here and I create a line like this, this barrier will never be crossed. Now that is something that some players will be quite intrigued by, but when it comes down to competitive play, all this will really do is prevent tanks from ever having any play in this area. If you have hedgerows instead, however, once larger vehicles start rolling out into the field, they can dynamically change this play completely by knocking the hedgerows down. They can be used early game to change the way that infantry engage each other, but for later game, it doesn't really give you very much fun. What you could do, however, is have groves like this in areas that probably should be naturally screened. If I put them on this corner, for example, there's still access to this far corner, but you won't be able to travel from this victory point northwards to the next one. And ideally, you want some form of barrier between victory points so that the same units can't go capturing the entire map. You want to have some form of barrier there somewhere. So let's mirror this. Even though most of my own maps won't be very mirrored, it's something that is highly recommended for your first few maps. And in this case, that might actually do us. The only other place where you might want to put loads of groves is going to be on the outskirts, just to kind of blend the area in, so that it doesn't look like a random map placed in the middle of nowhere. So let's dot a few random ones on or near the red line, like so. There we go, that's a bit better. What you'll also notice as well is that there's one very particular asset called Grove Simple. And this one I wouldn't recommend for use within the actual gameplay area itself. If I zoom in on these groves, you can see the details on the individual leaves, and they look quite decent. Whereas if I place one of the Grove Simple, the details are nowhere near as good, and that's on purpose. These groves have very low memory usage, but cover a very large area. and with random rotation on, they are great for filling in gaps. You can place them around the outskirts of your map, and they are just perfect for making everything look a little bit busier, so you don't have to worry about the outskirt details too much. Now, some mappers I know will put a lot of detail into their out-of-bound areas, and I personally will do so with certain maps. In particular, if you consider that in-game, I will not see very much of the out-of-bounds area to the south and southeast and southwest, because my camera will not be able to go beyond this line. But my camera will be able to see quite a lot of the north, northeast and northwest. So usually I would focus most of my out-of-bounds detail in this upper section here. But this lower section down here won't get very much detail because nobody will really see it unless they go looking. Anyways, that's the very basics so far for trees. Let's have a look at hedgerows for a second. So if I close that window down and go on to hedgerow, you have a very large selection of wild hedges. You've got wild hedges in fall, and you've got frosted and snow versions as well. If you get these out, you should be able to see that they are all slightly different. They have a different structure, different heights, but they all do exactly the same thing. They have practically the same footprint, and they all offer the exact same resistance to vehicles. Light vehicles will not be able to crush them, but tanks and heavy vehicles will. So what they will do is funnel engagements early on in the game, and then be broken down late in the game to open things up. So just for example, let's put a few small hedgerows in there. Let's say we put a little bit of a hedgerow down here, and I'm breaking this apart for now because I want to use different types of hedges themselves. There we go. So this will create a very solid wall to begin with a gap for some units to get through. And then let's do something similar on this side, but nowhere near as big. And then branch it off this way if we want. Again, this isn't particularly balanced yet, it's just to kind of give you an idea. The other assets that we're going to have a look at for now, but I won't actually place on this map yet, I can show you a few however, are rocks. If you go onto cliff rocks, there is a very large collection. The Holland boulders in particular were the ones that we originally had, and are still probably the most robust. If you have a look at some of them, they go from being very, very large to very, very small. These rocks themselves also have a footprint that will stop units from passing through them, and if you go onto the line of sight tool again, you'll notice that they don't actually block line of sight, because these rocks are usually placed inside steep cliffs to make them look a little bit more realistic. They aren't normally used in the middle of a field because how often do you walk through a rural area and come across a rock this size? So, depending on what you want to do, usually you'll find that hedges, groves and rocks are the most popular objects to place. But before we go and leave objects behind for now, we should go on to buildings. So if you go into Art Ambient, because buildings are man-made, you'll come across bridges, buildings, and objects. The KOTOR section I wouldn't worry about in particular, but objects is where you'll find the vast majority of the stuff you're looking for. And just to show you, this has everything in it from barrels, ruins, features for houses, marketplace objects, wrecked vehicles, and walls. There are so many things within the objects folder, you will spend the vast majority of your time there. In the buildings, however, there's a little trick to it. There are now 5 folders for buildings, and it's highly recommended that you only use buildings for one of these per map. So if you start using objects from the Ardennes Rural folder, avoid using some from the Urban folder. It causes some not insignificant problems for people on lower spec PCs, and it's lag and issues that are not necessary for building a map. You'll find that most of the folders will have enough for your purposes. Now, in this case, I wanted to build a map based around a rural area in France or maybe Germany. So if we go into the Ardennes Rural and then into buildings, there are loads of different sections here. Each building usually has next to it the size coordinates. This usually refers to the width, the length, and the height. So if you come across a building like a church, 6 by 8 by 7 is a large building. And if I right click it here, it is the biggest building that you can get at the moment. It is huge, but a little bit out of place for this. Whereas a 1 by 1 by 1 shed is pretty small. It will hold one squad, probably not even a large squad at that. It has one door, 3 windows, and will very easily be destroyed. But these buildings are usually something you'll find in every single map. Where you place them is entirely up to you. But what we'll do to get us started is just place a few very basic ones. So let's start with a very small stone house. And let's stick it, why not, about here. Now because our map is mirrored, we could do something that's similar on this side. So let's find another 2 by 2 by 2 building, like this one. And place it here. Now, this south side I want to be where our flood element really came in. So let's keep the rest of our buildings up here for now. Let's find a nice plaster, maybe 3 by 3 by 3. And have a look at what we've got. And that's not too bad. What I'll do is place this one directly flush with the grove behind it. And that means that any units that get inside this building will not be able to fire through the grove. They'll only be able to use these windows, and these ones. And again, because we have a mirrored layout, we should probably find a similar building and make a similar idea. Now in this case, I won't use that one because it looks too similar to the previous building. That one, however, looks quite nice. And because that one has no windows on this side, let's stick that against the grove over here. Now, technically speaking, if we're looking at buildings like this, you'll realise that this one is taller, and that will affect gameplay. Buildings that are taller will allow units to see further and fire further, so we've got to be careful about what we do with them. Also, you'll notice that in-game, although not here, if I stick the line of sight tool on and hold it near the building, you can't see through this hedge. But in likelihood, this building, because it's so tall, will see straight over the hedgerow, so we might have to be careful about what we do with this building. We may end up having to replace it with one which is similar, but a floor shorter. Anyways, that is the very, very basics of the object placement tool, and we shouldn't really have to worry about much more. What we should be doing next, though, is going back into the Spline Tool, which is up there on your toolbar, and making some designer roads. And this is just something simple before we move on to the next steps in the more advanced tutorials. But no map is complete without an idea of a road system. So if you go into Textures, as before, close down NMUI, which was open last, and look for NM Designer. Now we've been in here before. This is where our soft map edges are, but there are 3 splines called Narrow Road. 3 meters, 5 meters, and 7 meters. 7 meters is the width, and it refers to how large the road is going to be. Most major roads will probably be between 7 and 10 meters wide. So let's use that one to start with. What I like having is a roadway that will move just outside of each HQ area. You don't necessarily want to have a road that runs through a HQ area, because roads themselves can give negative cover. Units that are standing on them will receive damage and suppression faster. It's like being exposed on a roadway rather than being hidden amongst grass. So if we accidentally have one running through our main HQ, some retreating units could be killed quite easily. So like as before with splines, let's use the right click and create some nice long splines. Again, try to avoid going over anything that's longer than 10. And just create some basic roads. You'll also notice up here we have a button called Set to Optimum Width, which I'd recommend you click, and then fix tiling to width as before, so that we have the real width of the road. And this is 7 meters wide, supposedly. But if you click on it and you scroll up, you'll actually see that the width there is set to 5. Change it to 7, hit enter, set to present width, and 7 meters is actually a little bit narrower. The optimum width, it seems, for this one is probably set at around 8, 9, or maybe 10, which is fine by me. I'll keep it at that optimum width. So what I can do is jump into my bird's eye view by holding the Alt key and rotating. And I will add a few more roads onto this map just to give it a little bit of flavour. Again, once I've placed every single one, I go on to set optimum width and fix tiling width. The roadways should also be as similar as they can be. You don't want to give any particular teams major bonuses if you can help it. But do feel free to be as creative as you want. The more unique your roadways look, the better. Some maps you can get away with looking like this, where there's very little in the way of major road networks. I think I might add a few smaller roads to this, like go on to narrow road 5 meter, and maybe add something here that curves around. Might just move that over slightly and readjust this one by hitting shift and changing my nodes. There we go. And I can also link these together this way. We should also try and make sure that it's fair on the other side. So we've got a road going this way, but we don't have one here. So let's do this. That's perfect for me. And because this side has a road here, but this one doesn't, let's link that up. But, how to do this one? Let's go back. Yeah, that should do. And then what we can do is wrap this one round, so they link together. If you zoom out, that is your very basic road network. There's not really much more we should worry about with splines for now. We will come back to them, because the spline tool is the main method of creating walls, like dry stone walls and fences. So we will definitely need it at some point. But for now, that's a good enough idea for a basic map. What we'll need to go on to now, though, is the height mapping tool. Now, we don't have to do a lot with the height mapping tool at all, but it's over here on the toolbar, and it's called the height map editor. This uses a very simple system. It's based around the left mouse button and the right mouse button being used in conjunction. If you click on the left mouse button mode, you should find that you've got options 1 to 4, additive, subtractive, set value, and smoothing. And on the right mouse button you have the exact same 4 options, but they are numbered 5, 6, 7, 8 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. And by using the numbers on your keyboard, you can actually change the options that are currently in play if you really want to. But personally, I always prefer to click on them so I know what I'm using. Additive, very simply, will always increase the mass of land. So if I use the additive tool over here, for example, it will add a hill. If I go into the subtractive, it will do the opposite. It will subtract from the land and create ditches and holes. The set value, on the other hand, will use the value which is written in there, which is currently 20 meters. Now, 20 meters is way higher than the land I'm stuck with at the moment, and it will do this. And I can check the height of my current area by hitting the sample button and then clicking on any area you want. And at the moment it tells me that my land is at 10 meters. If I ever want to flatten a large area out, I should usually sample the height that I want and then use the sample tool to flatten it. And then finally, smoothing will only work if you've got 2 areas that have different heights, and we'll have a look at that in some depth in a moment. Also on this tool, you've got the brush size, which can go up to a good old 64. And this can cover a very large area if you really want to cover a large area. And the feather can go up to 100 or down to 0. And this will choose how smooth the transition is. If, for example, I go onto the additive tool and I have a feather of 0, you'll notice that it has extremely sharp edges and it basically lifts the entire area as a plateau. But if I put my feather at 100, it will create a soft-edged lump or mountain. It can give you more realistic shapes, and I usually recommend you have feather at least on. It doesn't have to be 100, but you have it on is a recommendation. And at the bottom here, the strength is how quickly and how sharply it will make these changes. So just by clicking once with the additive tool with strength 100 will make that mound, but down at 1 is barely noticeable. You can use a lower strength to make much more subtle and gradual changes if you wanted to. For example, trying to dig out a ditch at the side of a road with a very high strength is almost impossible, and you'll end up cleaving a very large canyon instead of a small ditch. This other part here, which is called Edit Top Layer, we don't need to worry about for now. This is when you're adding snow or mud, and will be covered in the more advanced tutorials later on down the line. For now, however, let's focus on some very basic height mapping. So I said before I wanted this southern area to be where the flood is. So, if I sample the ground down here, I know it's at height 10. Let's change this to maybe about 7. So I type 7 in, hit enter, and I can use the set value tool, maybe increase the brush size quite a bit, and wherever I paint, even at strength 1, it is going to drop it down to an area at 7 meters high. What I'm going to do is paint this area quite simply all around so that everything is around the same height. Now, something that was very particularly common during World War II is that the retreating Wehrmacht and German armies would flood land wherever they could. Several dams were broken as well by Allied missions, the famous dam busters. Just for an example, that caused a lot of floods in lower lying areas. In particular in the Netherlands, broken dams would cause massive problems. And battlefields, especially during the invasion of Normandy, were often flooded. Mostly intentionally in order to slow down advancing armies. So what we'll do here is try to mirror that a little bit and have a small flooded section down here. So that is the area I want to work with. If I go on to the water placement tool, I can right click wherever I want and it will place water in certain lowland areas. If I were to do that on the upper area up here, for example, the entire map would be flooded, which looks, weird. But let's get rid of that. I hit Ctrl Z and avoid that one for now. This area down here, however, is nicely flooded. What we may also notice is if I click on this, it allows me to choose the depth it's at and it tells me what the actual water level is. Now, if I'm not mistaken, a water depth of 2 meters is too much for any units to traverse. And this is where I can show you one of the most important shortcuts of the entire World Builder. If you hold down Ctrl, Shift and F5, what it does is bring up the impasse. You can also do this by going on to Overlay, and it should be there. Regenerate impasse only. Any area in this mode that is red cannot be traversed by vehicles or by infantry. So this water here is actually too deep. If I want to change the water level, I can actually do so by holding down the H key and then left clicking and dragging up and down. The marker will go red if it's below the current water level, and if I keep an eye on the current water level on the right hand side, it will tell me what height the water is currently at. If it goes blue, it's going higher than it was before. So let's take it down below 8. There we go. Let go of it, and the water is much shallower. If I hit Ctrl, Shift and F5 once more, it now tells me that this entire area is passable. So the water is still here, but I can easily traverse through it. If we go back onto the height map editor now, what I want to do is smooth down these edges so that it isn't really noticeable. I'm going to knock down the strength to 100, and then just hold down the right mouse button and smooth all of this area so that the land and the water blend together. If you were creating rivers, this might not necessarily be the case. You might want some steeper edges on your rivers. But for me, I just wanted there to be a more difficult route to get to this fuel point here, and just to add a little bit of depth and a bit of something interesting. I could also, if I really wanted to, sample the lowland here, maybe change my brush size a little bit, and just paint a little bit more land in, and then smooth down these edges again so that it looks like there's different fields and different areas that have been flooded. Now, as long as, if I go back into my water placement tool, as long as the actual tap, the water tap here, is not on land, it will still provide water to any areas at this depth, which is absolutely fine. If I move the water node up onto dry land until it goes red, there will be no water. It will be removed from the area. So as long as there is water in low-lying areas where it can actually generate some water, and if I move my mouse down, my camera will go almost entirely under the water, then it will create some. For now, however, this is almost the last step for our basic map. I should be able to save it as it is, and this is almost entirely playable. There are some other steps that can make play better, and we'll go through those in the more advanced tutorial. But if you were dying to get your hands on playing this, there's only 2 more steps really that I would suggest, and they're very quick. The first one is if we go onto the object placement tool again, we need to make sure that our HQ areas are not entirely undefended. So close down the environment tab and go back to gameplay, where we managed to place our territory points. And you'll notice near the top is one particular one called bunker marker. The bunker marker is, when right clicked, a very simple shape that creates a bunker for your teams. And again, if you are familiar with Company of Heroes 1 or 2, you will know that every HQ area has a bunker protecting it so that infantry can't rush in early game. If I place 2 bunkers there back to back, covering the entrances, and do the same on this team, this will mean that when I actually go to test it, you shouldn't have the enemy running straight in. But what I need to make sure I do is assign these bunkers to a team. At the moment, if I click on them, where it says current, the player assignment is world, which is no good, because they will spawn and have no owner and won't actually protect you. So if you click on the HQ area, note that it says player 1. I just need to click on these together, and go to the player assignment and hit player 1. And they will now belong to that team. And same over here, player 2, click these both, and hit player 2. Once again, hit save. And the final step is to go on to File and go on to Export Package. This will bring up a small window and it will come up eventually saying Package Successfully Saved To. And it will tell you where the directory is. And it's the same directory that we looked at in the very first video. Once you hit OK, however, you don't need to go looking for that file. You should be able to load up Company of Heroes, and the map with the name 2-Player Flood should already be there in your map list. This will give you an opportunity to test it, and then when eventually you are happy, or if you get an idea of what you want to change, you should be able to come back and join us for the next step in the more advanced tutorial. Once again, please remember that the links to the written wiki are in the description below. So if there's any steps that you need to check up on, or if there's anything you would rather read than watch, please do check that out and continue reading on for the more advanced tutorial with the video links that will be attached. I hope to see you in our next step.